Demaryius Thomas does not need to be reintroduced to football fans. If you watched the NFL during the early 2010s, you already know who he was. You remember him as a core piece of the Broncos offense, a receiver who stayed productive through different quarterbacks, different versions of the team, and different expectations about what Denver needed to do in order to win. You remember the physicality. You remember how difficult he was to bring down once the ball was in his hands. The stiff arm. And you remember that, for a long stretch of time, the Broncos never had to wonder who their primary receiver was. It was always Demaryius Thomas. That's why this story isn't about arguing for his place in history. It isn't about convincing anyone that he was great. His career already answers those questions. What makes Demaryius Thomas worth a deep dive is how deliberately his career was built. He entered the league as a first-round pick, but he wasn't a finished wide receiver coming out of college. He came from a college system that did not prepare him for the volume, timing, and precision that the NFL demands from the position. He dealt with injuries early. He played through instability at quarterback, and for his first few seasons, his development happened in real time, in front of everyone, without the benefit of a clear runway. When the environment around him finally stabilized, his career didn't just improve, it transformed. Not in a sudden, miraculous way, but in a way that revealed how much of his early career had been about adaptation rather than limitation. And that arc matters, because it mirrors how football actually works. We often talk about players as if talent alone determines outcome, but careers are shaped by context just as much as ability. Demaryius Thomas is one of the clearest examples of that relationship. He had elite physical traits from the start, but it took structure, repetition, and a precise offensive system for those traits to fully translate into sustained dominance. That's why his best years weren't just productive, but they were repeatable. They weren't dependent on one type of play or one kind of matchup. He became a receiver who could be built into a weekly structure of an offense, not just a feature when things broke down. And that's also why his career holds up when you look beyond the highlights. Whether it's the overtime touchdown against Pittsburgh that put him on the map, his role in the record-setting offense in 2013, the Super Bowl 50 win, those moments are all real, and they all matter, but they are not the whole story. They are the visible checkpoints of a career that was defined more by consistency than spectacle. This video is about slowing that career down and walking through it carefully. Not to dramatize it, and not to flatten it into a list of accomplishments, but to understand how Demaryius Thomas became the player that Broncos fans trusted for nearly a decade. Because when you trace his path from Georgia to Georgia Tech, to his raw early NFL career, to being a spotlight in one of the most demanding offensive environments that the league has ever seen, you don't just see a great wide receiver, you see a case study in development, and that's where this story actually begins. Demaryius Thomas was born on January 25th, 1988, in Montrose, Georgia. His childhood was marked by instability that had nothing to do with football. His mother, Katina Smith, was incarcerated for much of his youth, and Demaryius spent long stretches of his early life being raised by relatives. This isn't important as a dramatic origin story. It's important because it explains why Demaryius Thomas never carried himself like someone who expected things to be handed to him. When the structure isn't guaranteed early in life, you learn to value it when you find it. And you also learn not to rely on attention or affirmation as motivation. People who knew Thomas growing up consistently described him as reserved and focused, someone who didn't talk much, but he took responsibility seriously. When football entered his life, it was seen as something dependable. Practices were scheduled. Expectations were clear. Effort translated directly into opportunity. In that kind of environment, rewards consistency more than flash. As a teenager in Georgia, his athletic ability was obvious. He was big, he was fast, he was unusually strong for his age. But he wasn't treated like a finished product or a future star. He was treated like someone who had to earn every step forward, and that mindset stayed with him. This is where a lot of the misunderstandings about Demaryius Thomas begin. When people describe him as quiet or understated or low-key, those weren't personality traits he adopted as a professional athlete. They were habits that were built long before the NFL entered the picture. And by the time college recruiters started paying attention, Thomas wasn't chasing the spotlight. He was chasing an opportunity. And Georgia Tech had offered him a path forward, and he took it, even though it wasn't the kind of program that traditionally produced polished NFL wide receivers. And that choice mattered, because it meant that his development would be slower. It would be more uneven and far less visible than players coming out of pass-heavy systems like Alabama or LSU. It also meant that when he finally reached the NFL, his career would be defined less by hype and more by growth. And that's why Georgia Tech is such a critical part of this story. Not because it made Demaryius Thomas famous, but because it forced him to become adaptable before the league ever asked him to be. Demaryius Thomas arrived at Georgia Tech in 2006, and almost immediately, his college career took a different shape than most future NFL wide receivers. And it wasn't because of his ability, but it was because of the system. He had joined a fractured team that had yet to find their head coach. In 2007, the team started the year with longtime Georgia Tech head coach Chan Bailey. Up until this season, Bailey had coached in 64 games, leading the team to 37 wins and 4 bowl games. He had never finished a season under 500. A main reason he was let go was due to his inability to win the big game. Georgia Tech had lost 6 straight against the Georgia Bulldogs, and they were 2-3 in bowl games. And although he never had a losing season, the fans wanted more. The team that DT had joined was no more. After the temporary head coach, John Tapura, was let go, the team had decided to make a big splash. They snatched up Navy head coach Paul Johnson. Georgia Tech, under head coach Paul Johnson, ran a triple option offense built around the run game. The passing attack was secondary by design. It existed to punish defenses when they overcommitted. It wasn't there to showcase wide receivers through volume. And that matters because college is where most NFL wide receivers learn the position in bulk. It's where they run the full route trees every week. They learn how to read coverages repeatedly and properly, and they build timing through repetition. At Georgia Tech, Demaryius Thomas did not get that luxury. The offense simply did not throw the ball enough for any receiver to accumulate traditional resume numbers. In many games, Georgia Tech attempted fewer than 20 passes. Some games, far fewer. And for a receiver with NFL aspirations, that changed the entire evaluation process. Georgia Tech, as a team, was seeing phenomenal success with this new program, going 9-4 in 2008 and 11-3 in 2009, where the team would top out at 7 on the AP Top 25 list. But there was drama at the top from the NCAA. In a 2011 report from the NCAA, the team was put on 4 years of probation, with a game being forfeited as well as their ACC championship. They were also fined for $100,000. This was a school-wide punishment that stretched from football to basketball. And the NCAA said that Georgia Tech should have declared an unidentified football player ineligible after he allegedly accepted $312 worth of clothing from a friend of a sports agency employee. And it was later reported by the Atlanta Journal that the unnamed player was Demaryius Thomas. To add on to that, the school also failed to cooperate with the NCAA during the investigation. So this was all retroactive punishment for actions during the 2009 season. Thomas redshirted his first year, and then he began contributing in a limited but meaningful role. What's important is not just how often he touched the ball, but what happened when he did. By the time he reached his junior season in 2009, the contrast between opportunity and production became impossible to ignore. In the 2009 season, Demaryius Thomas caught 46 passes for 1,154 yards and 8 total touchdowns. Those numbers don't just stand out within Georgia Tech's offense. They stand out nationally when you consider the context. That's an average of 25 yards per reception. That figure alone tells you how he was being used. It wasn't as a safety valve, it wasn't as a possession receiver, but it was as a vertical weapon. And despite the limited passing volume, Thomas became the most dangerous downfield option in the ACC. He earned first team All-ACC honors, recognition that acknowledges how dominant he had been relative to the opportunities that he was given. And this is where the evaluation becomes complicated. The scouts watching Georgia Tech tape were not seeing a finished wide receiver. They weren't seeing a player who had been asked to run every route in the book or adjust to every coverage look. What they were seeing was a raw physical profile. Thomas stood around 6'3". He weighed over 220 pounds and he had legitimate breakaway speed. And once the ball was in his hands, defensive backs struggled to bring him down cleanly. Question wasn't whether he could play in the NFL. Question was how much projection a team was willing to accept. On one hand, it limits certainty. There are fewer reps on tape, fewer examples of nuanced route work, and fewer clean answers. On the other hand, it creates upside because if the physical traits are real and the player is willing to learn, the ceiling can be significantly higher than what the college production suggests. So Demaryius Thomas entered the draft as exactly that kind of player. He finished his career at Georgia Tech with 120 receptions, 2,339 yards, and 14 touchdowns. And this was over just 3 seasons. Those totals aren't modest when viewed honestly, but they also don't resemble the stat lines of a receiver that is coming out of a wide receiver university. And that discrepancy is the entire story. He wasn't underdeveloped because of a lack of ability. He was underdeveloped because of circumstance. By the time Demaryius Thomas entered the 2010 NFL Draft, teams agreed on one thing immediately. The physical profile was real. He came in at 6'3", weighed 225 pounds, and when healthy, he ran like someone much smaller. The scouts had timed him in a low 440 range in the 40-yard dash during training, a rare number for a receiver that size. But the draft process for Demaryius Thomas was never going to be straightforward. In late college workouts, he suffered a Jones fracture in his foot, an injury that kept him from participating in the NFL Combine. And that mattered. For a prospect whose evaluation relied heavily on traits and projection rather than volume-heavy college resume, missing the combine removed one of the easiest ways for teams to confirm what they thought they saw on film. So the process shifted. Teams had to lean harder on the game tape, and they leaned harder on medical evaluations. And then they leaned heavily on his pro day, where Thomas ran well, he caught cleanly, and he confirmed that the explosiveness hadn't disappeared because of the injury. Questions that teams were asking were not about effort or character. Those boxes were clean. Coaches consistently described him as mature, coachable, serious about improvement. The questions were football specific. Could he run a full NFL route tree after coming from a triple option offense? Could he develop timing and nuance quickly enough to justify a first round investment? And how much patience would it take before the return matched the draft slot? Those questions didn't push him down the board, but they did define where he landed. And the 2010 receiving class wasn't shallow. It included players who were more polished, players who came from spread offenses, players who had college tape that looked more NFL ready at first glance. But Demaryius Thomas was different. He was the kind of prospect that forced teams to decide how they build. Do you draft certainty, knowing exactly what you're getting? Or do you draft upside, knowing the early years might be uneven? There were only 2 receivers that went in the first round of the draft in 2010. The Dallas Cowboys took Dez Bryant with their 24th overall pick, a receiver from the Big 12. He had around the same build as Demaryius Thomas, but he had more experience in college. The Denver Broncos selected Demaryius Thomas with the 22nd overall pick in the first round. They did so fully aware that he wasn't entering the league as a finished receiver. This was not a pick made for immediate gratification. And later in the first round, the Broncos also took Florida quarterback Tim Tebow, a former Heisman winner and a prolific dual-threat quarterback. But with DT, it was an investment. And investments come with timelines. Denver believed that they could give him professional coaching, consistent quarterback play, and time to adjust to NFL detail work. The ceiling would justify the risk. What no one could fully predict was how fragmented the early environment would be, because drafting a projection only works if the development path stays intact. For Demaryius Thomas, the league would ask him to develop on the fly, with injuries, with quarterback changes, with a system that was still searching for its own identity. The draft process had identified him correctly. He was a rare athlete with elite potential who would need time. What came next would determine whether that potential turned into production. Demaryius Thomas entered the 2010 season with a first-round label and a very specific challenge in front of him. He wasn't just adjusting to the speed of the NFL, he was adjusting to the position itself. He was coming out of Georgia Tech's triple option offense. Thomas had never ran a full professional route tree in an offense before. He hadn't lived in an offense based around timing-based passing concepts. He hadn't been asked to read coverages on the fly while maintaining precise spacing with a quarterback. And those things are foundation when playing wide receiver in the NFL. And for most players, that foundation is laid long before draft night. But for Thomas, it was built in real time. And the reality of that showed up quickly. During his rookie season in 2010, Demaryius Thomas appeared in 10 games. He finished with 22 receptions, 283 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And those numbers are modest at best for a first-round wide receiver. And it's important not to pretend otherwise. They also don't tell the full story of what his rookie year actually represented, because the rookie season for a high-ceiling player like Demaryius Thomas isn't about totals, it's about translation. The Broncos offense that year was still searching for direction. The quarterback situation had been unsettled, the scheme lacked continuity, and Thomas himself dealt with injuries that interrupted his availability and rhythm. And that combination matters. We saw the year start with Cal Orton as the starting quarterback. Eventually, the team moved over to the rookie quarterback, Tim Tebow. Wide receiver development relies heavily on repetition. Routes aren't just run, they are refined through timing, trust, and thousands of identical reps. Every missed practice, every missed games slows that process. When you look at Demaryius Thomas's rookie output, the question isn't why the numbers were low. The question is what was visible underneath them. And what was visible was this. When the ball found him in space, the physical traits translated immediately. He averaged just under 13 yards per reception as a rookie, despite limited usage and an offense that didn't consistently put him in advantageous situations. When he caught the ball, it didn't go down easily. Defensive backs struggled to wrap him up cleanly, and linebackers couldn't match his acceleration. That matters because it confirms something crucial. The leap from college to the NFL hadn't overwhelmed him physically. It was the technical side that needed time, and that's exactly what Denver had expected when they drafted him. The problem, of course, is that the NFL doesn't develop players in isolation. While Thomas was learning the finer points of the position, the offense around him was still unstable. The quarterback changes meant timing resets. You went from a right-handed quarterback to a left-handed quarterback. The ball comes out different. The scheme changes meant different route emphases. Injuries meant interrupted momentum. And for a player whose draft profile already required patience, the early environment didn't provide much of it. But even within that reality, the Broncos saw enough to stay committed. They didn't treat his rookie season as a disappointment. They treated it as the first stepping block because the traits were still obvious. The effort was still consistent, and the flashes, while infrequent, were legitimate. And by the end of his rookie year, Demaryius Thomas wasn't a finished product. But he wasn't behind schedule either. He was exactly where the projection had put him and where he was expected to be. He was learning, he was adapting, he was gradually closing the gap between raw athleticism and professional execution. And in his second season, that gap began to narrow. By the time the 2011 season began, Demaryius Thomas was no longer just a developmental project. He was healthy enough to play regularly, and he began to settle into an identifiable role. What he did not have, however, was a conventional passing environment. The Broncos' offense in 2011 revolved around Tim Tebow, and that fact shaped everything about how the passing game functioned. This was not an offense built on volume or rhythm through the air. It was built on ball control, field position, and asking the passing game to strike selectively. And for a wide receiver, that kind of structure changes the math. The opportunities might be fewer, the mistakes are magnified, and the production has to come in chunks rather than accumulation. Demaryius Thomas adapted to that reality. During the 2011 season, he played in 11 games. He finished with 32 receptions for 551 yards and 4 touchdowns. Those raw totals don't jump off the page, but the efficiency does. He averaged just over 17 yards per catch, one of the clearest indicators of how he was being used. This was not a receiver being fed underneath targets to stay involved. This was a receiver being asked to change the field position when the moment allowed. That role fits his skill set. Demaryius Thomas had already shown that once the ball is in his hands, he was difficult to tackle. And in an offense that asked its receivers to maximize limited chances, that trait carried real value. Defenses knew that even a short completion could turn into something much larger if the angles were missing or tackling broke down. And while he was not the primary target on every critical down, he was becoming the player Denver leaned on for explosive plays. And that became impossible to ignore in the postseason. On January 8th, 2012, the Broncos hosted the Pittsburgh Steelers in the AFC wildcard round. The Broncos are coming off of a 8-8 record that would land them in first place in the AFC West. They were led by longtime Carolina Panthers head coach John Fox. The team is coming off of 3 straight losses to finish the regular season, hobbling into the postseason. And they were playing a red-hot Pittsburgh Steelers team who has won 2 straight games and finished their season with a 12-4 record. On paper, Pittsburgh should destroy the Denver Broncos. But Pittsburgh failed to do the one thing that you always need to do. Pittsburgh finished the season second in their division, and this made it so that they had to play on the road in Denver, Colorado. Let's set the scene. Pittsburgh gets the ball first, and they march down the field, taking up 4 minutes to score on a 45-yard field goal. On Denver's first offensive drive, they did a lot of nothing. The offense looked as incapable of moving the ball as it had the last few weeks, and both teams exchanged a few punts before Pittsburgh was able to put together a 6-minute drive to score another field goal, making the score 6-0 after the first quarter. On the next drive, to start the second quarter, we saw our protagonists today make a play. From Denver's 18-yard line, Tebow dropped a 51-yard pass to Demaryius Thomas that would flip the field. Demaryius Thomas had beaten his man, Ike Taylor, and this play would set up a Tebow pass to Eddie Royal for a 30-yard touchdown. And after the extra point, the Broncos were ahead 7-6. Pittsburgh went 3-and-out on their next drive, giving the ball right back to Denver, who had just proven that they can hang with the big dogs. On second down, Tebow would drop another bomb to Demaryius Thomas for 58 yards. This play was over corner Ike Taylor again. Tebow would run the ball in 2 plays later for the touchdown, and Denver was now up 14-6. And Pittsburgh's next drive ended even worse. Big Ben threw an interception to Quentin Carter, setting the Broncos up in the red zone with a first down. The team would add another field goal, going up 17-6, and the teams would exchange a few longer drives before Denver was able to put up another field goal with 1 minute to go in the half. The score was 20-6, a demanding halftime lead for a team who is said to have no chance. Denver would start the second half with a long 5-minute drive, but would punt the ball at Pittsburgh's 28-yard line. It was a passive move by head coach John Fox, and Pittsburgh would put together a methodical drive that would last for 6 minutes and end with a Mike Wallace touchdown. The next drive would see the battle between DT and corner Ike Taylor heat up, where Tebow would launch a ball DT's way and get a pass interference call on Ike Taylor. This would set up Denver at midfield. The team would continue to slowly march down the field and settle for a field goal with 13 minutes left in the fourth quarter. The score is now 23-13. Pittsburgh would quickly move down the field, grabbing a quick field goal of their own, and the game is now a one-possession contest. It's 23-16. The next drive for Denver had a quick completion for 15 yards to Demaryius Thomas, but then Denver Broncos running back Willis McGahee would fumble the ball away at midfield, and this fumble would lead to be costly, as the team would give up a touchdown on a long drive by Big Ben. Both teams would try, but fail to score before regulation could end. The score is tied. We're going to overtime. Demaryius Thomas is sitting at 3 receptions for 124 yards at the end of regulation. And after a touchback, history would happen.
And here we go. First snap of the overtime. The Broncos have been in 3 overtime games this year. They won them all. Got him. It's Thomas at the 50. To the 20. Thomas to the 10.
The Denver Broncos are moving on. They're going to go play New England next week. And that play became one of the most replayed moments of the decade. And it's important to be precise about what it was. It wasn't a miracle throw. It wasn't a broken play. It was a receiver using his size, speed, balance, strength to turn a routine concept into a game-ending result. And that moment did 2 things at once. It introduced Demaryius Thomas to a national audience, and it locked him into a public narrative that didn't fully capture his trajectory. Because while that touchdown became inseparable from the Tebow story and the Tebow era, it didn't define Demaryius Thomas' ceiling. It just showed a piece of it. The more important development during the Tebow era was quieter. Thomas had proven that he can thrive in an offense that offered him very little margin for error. He had shown that efficiency, not volume, could still translate into impact. And he had demonstrated that the physical traits held up under playoff pressure. What he had not yet experienced was consistency at quarterback, or a passing system built for a spread offense for receivers to excel. And that change was coming. Before the 2012 season, Denver Broncos signed Peyton Manning. He was coming off of a neck surgery, and he had just left the Indianapolis Colts. And by the time the 2013 season came, Demaryius Thomas was no longer a question mark. The projection phase of his career was over. What remained was responsibility. This is the season that Demaryius Thomas stopped being discussed as a talented receiver in a good situation and started being treated as a foundational piece of the offense. And that distinction matters. because 2013 wasn't just a good year for Denver. It was the most productive offensive season that the NFL has ever seen. The Broncos scored 606 points, the most by any team in a single season in NFL history. And they did it behind Peyton Manning, who threw a record-setting 55 touchdown passes that season. But this wasn't an offense where production was spread thin and random. The roles were clearly defined, and Demaryius Thomas's role was unavoidable. In 2013, he finished the season with 92 receptions, 1,430 receiving yards, and 14 touchdowns. Those numbers matter, but what matters most is when you understand how they were accumulated. Demaryius Thomas was targeted 142 times that season, and that tells you something important. This wasn't a receiver being schemed open occasionally. This was a receiver being trusted repeatedly in a system built on precision. The common oversimplification of the 2013 Broncos is that everyone ate because Peyton Manning made it easy. And the deeper truth is that Manning made it demanding. His offenses didn't survive on improvisation. They survived on players being exactly where they were supposed to be when they were supposed to be there. And Demaryius Thomas not only met the standard, but he exceeded it. His most effective routes weren't exotic. They were efficient. Slants that punished off coverage. He had in-breaking routes that split zone defenders. He had deep crossers that turned defensive leverage into open grass. These routes worked only if the receiver understands spacing and timing on a professional level. And by 2013, Demaryius Thomas did. And that's why his production didn't fluctuate wildly week to week. That's why he didn't disappear against disciplined defenses. And that's why he remained productive, even in games where he wasn't scoring touchdowns. The touchdowns themselves were also telling. 14 touchdowns is not a coincidence in an offense like that. That's usage in high leverage situations. It means he was trusted in the red zone. He was trusted on third downs, and he was trusted when defenses were most forced to stop Denver's passing attack. And defenses were focused, because by that point, Demaryius Thomas wasn't sneaking up on anyone. He was demanding the coverage, he was dictating alignments, and he was forcing defensive coordinators to choose where to allocate help. That's the difference between a productive receiver and a core offensive piece. The most important part of 2013 isn't that Demaryius Thomas thrived in a historic offense. It was that he was inseparable from it. When the Broncos needed an explosive play, he delivered. He had the consistency, and he brought the structure. This season didn't redefine who he was. It confirmed it, because by the end of 2013, Demaryius Thomas was no longer a receiver whose career needed explanation. He was one whose role could not be removed without changing the entire shape of the offense. And that's the version of him that would carry him forward into the final phase of his prime. 2013 may have ended on a sour note for the team, but the one bright spot from that Super Bowl appearance was the performance of Demaryius Thomas. He racked up 13 catches during the game, setting a then Super Bowl record for the most receptions in a Super Bowl. And this was something that the team can build off of. In 2015, Demaryius Thomas's mother had her sentence commuted by President Barack Obama, and his mother got to see her son play football in person for the first time during the Broncos' playoff win against the Pittsburgh Steelers in January of 2016. At the end of this game, Peyton Manning, who just took a knee to drain the rest of the clock, gave Thomas the football, gave Demaryius Thomas the football from that play, and he proceeded to give the ball to his mother. And by the time the Broncos had reached Super Bowl 50, Demaryius Thomas was no longer in the same phase of his career that defined the record-setting seasons. The offense was no longer built to overwhelm teams through volume and efficiency. The league has adjusted, the roster has changed, and most importantly, the way Denver needed to win has changed. Super Bowl 50 was not going to be decided by shootouts or timing-based passing concepts. It was going to be decided by defense, field position, and mistakes. And that reality reshaped the role of every offensive player on the field. During the 2015 regular season, Demaryius Thomas remained highly productive. He finished the year with 105 receptions for 1,304 yards and 6 touchdowns, still operating as Denver's primary wide receiver. And those numbers matter because they established that, even as the offense shifted, Thomas was still central to what Denver did offensively. But the postseason was different. In the playoffs, teams tend to strip offenses down to the essentials. They remove comfort, they force stars to contribute in ways that don't always show up in box scores. And that is what happened in Super Bowl 50. Against Carolina, Denver's defensive game plan dominated the narrative. The Broncos forced turnovers, they pressured the quarterback, they controlled the game from start to finish. Offensively, the priority was not explosion. It was protection, it was discipline, it was avoiding mistakes that could swing the momentum the other way. Demaryius Thomas finished the Super Bowl with 1 reception for 8 yards. And that stat line is often cited without context, and the context matters here, because his role in that game wasn't about accumulating catches. It was about occupying coverage, running routes with precision, and preventing Carolina from loading every resource into stopping the run or collapsing the pocket. Defenses don't stop respecting a receiver because the ball doesn't come their way. They respect alignment, reputation, and the consequences of a single missed assignment. And Carolina respected Demaryius Thomas. They accounted for him, and they didn't leave him isolated without help. And that attention created space elsewhere, even if it didn't produce personal statistics. This is one of the hardest parts about evaluating careers. Championship games rarely reward everyone equally in the box score. They reward adaptability. And Demaryius Thomas did what Denver needed him to do to win. When the clock hit 0, he became a Super Bowl champion. And that matters, not as a resume bullet, but as a reflection of how his career has evolved. He's been the explosive centerpiece, he's been the volume engine, and now, in the most important moment, he was part of a unit that understood how to win without demanding attention. It's not a decline, it's maturity. And once Peyton Manning retired, the question was unavoidable. What does Demaryius Thomas look like when a stabilizing force at quarterback is gone? When Peyton Manning retired after Super Bowl 50, the most obvious question facing the Broncos was about quarterback. The less obvious question was about everyone connected to that position. For the wide receivers in particular, the transition from a Hall of Fame quarterback to instability is rarely smooth. Timing changes, ball placement changes, reads change, and the margin for error gets thinner. And for Demaryius Thomas, this phase of his career would test something different than athleticism and route running. It would test sustainability. In 2016, Denver entered the season without a long-term answer at quarterback. The offense shifted away from the precision-based system that had defined the Manning eras, and the passing game had become more conservative and more predictable. Despite that, Demaryius Thomas remained productive. He finished the 2016 season with 90 receptions for 1,083 yards and 5 touchdowns. Those numbers came in a very different environment than his peak seasons. This is no longer the offense that dictated terms of defense. This is an offense trying to manage games, trying to figure it out on the go. And Demaryius Thomas was no longer benefiting from the pre-snap control and the rapid reads that we saw from Peyton Manning that punished defensive mistakes instantly. Instead, he was working in tighter windows with fewer opportunities for yards after the catch and with defenses more willing to challenge the passing game. And even so, he remained Denver's most reliable option. The reliability is easy to miss when you focus on the decline narratives, but decline implies disappearance, and Thomas didn't disappear, he adjusted. In 2017, the situation became even more difficult. Denver cycled through quarterbacks again, and the offense struggled to maintain consistency week to week. The passing game rarely found its rhythm, and the scoring opportunities were harder to come by. Thomas finished the season with 83 receptions for 949 yards and 5 touchdowns, and for many receivers, this would represent a very solid season. But for Demaryius Thomas, it was interpreted as a decline, but the interpretation ignores the condition. He was still commanding coverages, still running the primary routes, still the number one option on his team. And he was being asked to stabilize the offense that lacked identity. And this is where the numbers need to be read carefully. His yards per catch dropped compared to the Manning years, but that wasn't because of his ability. It was because his role has changed. He was being asked to operate underneath more often, to move the chains, to give young or struggling quarterbacks safer options. He was being asked to be a role model to the future of Denver receiving. And that kind of role rarely produces highlight reels. It does, however, keep offenses functional. And in 2018, the Broncos were clearly in transition, and Demaryius Thomas was no longer at the center of their long-term plans. But even then, his value hadn't disappeared. Through his first half of the 2018 season with Denver, he continued to contribute before the franchise made a decision that reflected where they were heading. The era had ended, and it wasn't because Demaryius Thomas stopped being useful, but it was because the Broncos needed a full reset. They were in purgatory, and in order to get out of purgatory, they had to move on. And for the first time of his career, Demaryius Thomas would finish a season outside of Denver, and that transition would mark the beginning of the final chapter of his playing days. When the Broncos traded Demaryius Thomas during the 2018 season, it wasn't a referendum on what he had been. It was an acknowledgement on where the franchise was hidden. Denver was rebuilding, Thomas was in his 30s, and the two timelines no longer aligned. This is how most players actually change teams, quietly, without drama. He was traded to the Houston Texans in late October of 2018, stepping into a very different situation. Houston was a playoff contender with a young quarterback, and a faster offense with an established hierarchy that already included DeAndre Hopkins as the focal point. And this was not a place that Demaryius Thomas was going to be the guy. It was a place where he was asked to fit. And that distinction matters. In Houston, Thomas wasn't asked to dominate targets or carry the offense. He was asked to be reliable, to understand spacing, and give the quarterback a veteran presence who could win on schedule. In over 10 regular season games with the Texans in 2018, he caught 36 passes for 428 yards and 2 touchdowns. Of course, those numbers don't resemble his Denver peak, but they weren't supposed to. They reflected a player adapting to a complementary role, operating within an offense that already had its identity. What's notable is not the stat line itself, but the fact that he could still step into a playoff level offense mid-season and contribute immediately. That doesn't happen without professionalism, preparation, and a deep understanding of the position. After the season, Demaryius Thomas would enter free agency for the first time in his career. In April of 2019, he signed with the New England Patriots. On the New England Patriots, Demaryius Thomas described his time as a waste of his time. He thought that he would be the Patriots wide receiver this season, but instead, the team traded him to the New York Jets for a 6th round pick. And this was done so that the Patriots could sign Antonio Brown to their team. Demaryius Thomas became the instant starter for the New York Jets. It was a rare trade between AFC East rivals. He would go on to have 36 catches for 433 yards and 1 touchdown on the season. Demaryius Thomas would stay active and continue to try and sign with the team through the 2021 season, at which point he decided enough was enough. In his words, he said, "I'm Demaryius Thomas. I finally came to the decision to hang it up. I'm going to retire, and I'm going to retire a Denver Bronco. I'm done, and I did well." John Elway would say, DT was the complete package as a wide receiver. He grew into one of the very best at his position. The combination of his size, speed, strength, and athleticism was unmatched. Demaryius's remarkable consistency and productivity were instrumental in our offense setting historical records and our team winning a lot of games, including 2 AFC championships and Super Bowl 50. And the Broncos CEO Joe Ellis said, "For as humble and soft-spoken as Demaryius was during his 9 years with our organization, you would have never known he was such a dominant player in this league. DT was an integral part of one of the greatest offenses of all time, putting up record-setting numbers and giving Broncos fans so many unforgettable moments. I've never heard him power field at Mile High louder than his game-winning touchdown in overtime against the Steelers in the playoffs." If we look at Demaryius Thomas' stats after he retired, he played in 143 games. He brought in 724 passes for 9,763 yards, with 9,055 of those yards coming when he was with the Denver Broncos. This would land him at 2nd all-time in Broncos history, and his total yardage would leave him at 63rd all-time in receiving yards. It was a phenomenal career. He had 63 touchdowns, 60 of those coming with the Broncos. On December 9th, 2021, Demaryius Thomas was found dead in his home in Roswell, Georgia. He was just 33 years old. The news traveled quickly, not because it was shocking in a tabloid sense, but because it felt profoundly wrong. Thomas had been recently retired, still closely tied to the Broncos organization, still visible around the league, still very much a part of football's present tense. And then the following days, the details became clear. Demaryius Thomas had been dealing with seizure-related health issues, a condition that had been reported earlier in his life and later confirmed as a contributing factor in his death. Authorities ruled that his passing was a result of a complication from seizure disorder. This was not a story of recklessness or scandal. It was a reminder of something that the sport often obscures. NFL careers end, but the physical consequences don't always leave with them. Thomas's death resonated deeply across the league because of who he was, not just what he did on the team. Former teammates, coaches, and opponents all spoke about the same thing: his kindness, his humility, and the way he treated people when the cameras weren't present. In the days that followed his death, the Denver Broncos made it clear that this wasn't going to be handled quietly. They chose to honor Demaryius Thomas in a way that reflected how deeply embedded he was in the team and city's history. The first and most visible tribute came in the Broncos' very next game, a Week 14 matchup against the Detroit Lions at Empower Field at Mile High. Before kickoff, Thomas's images filled the stadium. His name, his number, his presence, they were everywhere. Teammates, coaches, fans, all understood that this game was not going to begin like a normal NFL game. And then came the moment that defined the tribute. On Denver's first offensive snap, the Broncos intentionally only sent 10 players onto the field, leaving Thomas's position empty. The team was immediately flagged for a penalty, which was then declined. It was deliberate. In football terms, it was a small cost, 5 yards, 1 possession. But in emotional terms, it was a powerful statement. The empty spot was the point. It represented the absence that couldn't be filled, and the respect that the organization was willing to show by acknowledging it publicly, even at the expense of a competitive advantage. Demaryius Thomas mattered here, and the tribute resonated far beyond Denver. Around the league, players and coaches spoke about the moment with admiration, not because it was flashy, but because it was sincere. Later that season, the Broncos would continue to honor Thomas with a jersey patch and in-stadium tributes, keeping his presence visible rather than allowing it to fade after one weekend. But the franchise didn't stop there. In 2023, the Broncos formally inducted Demaryius Thomas into the Ring of Fame, placing him permanently among the most important players in team history. The honor didn't reframe his legacy, it confirmed it. The Ring of Fame induction acknowledged everything Thomas had been to the organization. He was a first-round pick who developed into an elite receiver, a Super Bowl champion, a player whose best years coincide with one of the most significant stretches the franchise has ever experienced. But more importantly, it acknowledged the relationship between Demaryius Thomas and the city of Denver. He wasn't remembered simply for statistics. He was remembered for dependability, professionalism, and the way that he carried himself as a representative of the team. He gave back to the community of Denver. They reflected gratitude, and when franchises get moments like that right, they do more than honor a player. They tell future generations what kind of careers are valued. Demaryius Thomas's legacy is not frozen in a single play or a season. It lives in how the organization chose to remember him when he was no longer there to speak for himself. When you look back at Demaryius Thomas's career in full, the most striking thing is not any of the single seasons or single moment, but it's how complete the arc feels. He entered the league as a development project from a college system that didn't prepare him for instant success. He spent his early years learning the position in real time through injuries and instability. And when the environment finally aligned, he didn't just benefit from it, he became essential to it. At his peak, Demaryius Thomas is one of the most reliable wide receivers in football history. Not because he chased volume or highlights, because his skill set translated across situations. He could stretch the field, he could work underneath, he could punish defenses after the catch. He fit into a structure. And when the structure broke down, he still found ways to matter. When the league around him started to change, he adjusted with it. As the quarterbacks rotated and the offenses shifted, he remained productive, longer than most receivers do. And when his role eventually changed, he accepted it without friction. That willingness to adapt is part of why his career aged as well as it did. The way the Broncos chose to honor him after his unfortunate death tells you something important. Demaryius Thomas earned that respect through years of consistency, professionalism, and trust. He didn't demand to be remembered in a specific way. He didn't try and shape his legacy while he was playing. He simply showed up, did his job, and made the people around him better. And sometimes, that's the most lasting kind of legacy there is. Demaryius Thomas should be remembered as a Super Bowl champion, a cornerstone of one of the greatest offenses of all time, and one of the most important players in Denver Broncos history. But more than that, he'll be remembered as someone whose career makes sense when you take time to look at it. It's not just the highlights. It's not just the endings. It's all of it. Rest in peace, Demaryius Thomas. You are missed.